All right, this is the fourth and final video for week 7, dealing with the threats to biodiversity is what we're finishing up here with. So let's get through this and then you'll be done for this week with the videos. So there's this term HIPPO, and it's an acronym that was coined by E.O. Wilson, who's a very famous scientist. He's done a lot of interesting work, but he's done a lot with insects, particularly ants and whatnot. And he coined this phrase HIPPO, and it basically is a way to remember the major threats to biodiversity. So the HIPPO, here's what it stands for. H is habitat alteration, I is invasive species, P pollution, the second P population, and O is overharvesting. So we're going to go through each one of these and discuss them. All right, H, habitat alteration. Now, in this lecture, you're going to understand 3 different types of habitat alteration or habitat loss. Your book does not go into these, but you will see at least one question on the exam about these, so you need to understand them. So make sure that you take some notes and write some stuff down here. So there's, let me back up a minute here. So there's 3 different types of habitat alteration, okay? It's not all just habitat loss. Sometimes you're not actually losing the habitat, but you're changing it so that it's not as useful. So we're going to talk about fragmentation as the first one, then there's simplification, and then finally there's conversion. So let's talk about the differences between these. All right, fragmentation. In fragmentation, you're basically talking about splitting apart a natural habitat and ending up leaving little to no core area. Now, the core area is the kind of that main center area where species will move about. So if you don't have a really nice large core area, you're not really providing a large enough habitat for species to meet all their needs. So as we develop and continue to grow, humans are really good at splitting up and fragmenting habitat. And you can see in the picture down below there that you've got highways going across a major section of habitat. I mean, we've done that through our valley. The major highway, I-10, that runs through our valley, fragmented the north side to the south side. I mean, our bighorn sheep used to very easily be able to cross from San Gorgonio. They go over to Whitewater Canyon, come down the canyon and go up into San Jacinto, and we had all this genetic shift going and changing all through there. And now species are very inhibited. They can't get across some of those roads. Same with Highway 62 up where I live. The highway goes up there and crosses across habitat, so it's been fragmented. So the species no longer have ready access to all the resources that they need to survive, and oftentimes they have to cross really treacherous stretches of roads or climb over fences or go through neighborhoods to get from one area to another. So fragmenting habitat is one of the ways to alter it. Now, some of the ways that humans have come up with dealing with fragmentation is through wildlife corridors. And these are basically passageways that we create for animals to safely pass from one area to another. We've kind of already gone over this when we went through those layers of ecosystem terms. We talked about corridors and linkages. So you see some pictures there, some wildlife trying to cross the road. Oftentimes they'll go under roads or they'll go over. The idea is that you're trying, depending on the species, you try to do what's most useful. For example, if you go up Highway 62 into Morongo Valley where I live, you're going to come up the grade and through this twisty area. And they created a wildlife corridor, but it's an underpassage. So there's a little bridge and animals can cross through the canyon and go under there. Well, there have been studies by grad students who have placed cameras there, and there are bighorn sheep in that area. And they have seen that sheep literally come up right to where the underpass is, but they refuse to cross under it because that is not a natural thing for them. They are very sight animals. They need to be able to see. They like to be up high. So I was driving home not 2 weeks ago, and there was a 3-year-old male ram standing not 2 feet off the side of the road. Scared me to death. But that's the first time I've seen them crossing. When I started talking to people and asking, they said, yes, the sheep use that. And they've done studies that show they absolutely refuse to use that underpass. So it's important to do studies and know that the type of corridor you're putting in is going to be useful to the species that you're trying to get it to use. You don't want to put in an underpass for a species that's very sighted and wants to be able to go up high and see what's going on. All right, another way that you can alter habitat is through simplification. In simplification, you don't really completely destroy the habitat, but you basically reduce the complexity and make it so simple that it's really not very valuable to wildlife. Okay, so in the pictures here, in the upper left, you see a pine forest with many different species of trees. They're all coniferous, but there's some Doug fir in there and there's some lodgepole pine, and they're not in these nice, neat little rows. There's a lot of complexity to that versus the upper picture on the right, you've got a pine plantation with maybe one, at most two species. They're planted in these really simplified rows. Everything is weeded in between. It's a very simple habitat. It's not really useful for animals. Same thing with the natural grassland. In a natural grassland, you have many different species of grasses and plants all interacting, not only at the surface level, but underneath the surface in the soil, making the soil very stable and cycling those nutrients through. And if you come through and you plow it out and you just plant one single monocrop, like in a wheat field, again, you reduce that complexity. And so it's a very simple habitat, and you don't have nearly the amount of biodiversity that can use that habitat. Our yards are a great example of simplification. Most of you, including myself at times, I try really hard not to because I know, but a lot of us will go out, and you see a pile of dead leaves and you're like, oh man, look at all this trash out here. I got to get rid of this. And you rake up all the dead stuff and you trim up all the dead stuff around the end bottoms of the bushes. We go out and we shave our palm trees and take all that dead stuff off. Well, that is providing habitat for a lot of other animals. You leave that debris around and very quickly you're going to have lizards and spiders that come and take up residence in those areas, roaches and all that. And you may think you don't want them around, but those guys are all doing important jobs, keeping stuff cycling and circling around. So if you simplify that habitat too much, it's no longer real useful to the species in your area. And so you very quickly see that you don't have a lot of wildlife in your area. So try and keep that in mind the next time you go out and do yard work if you own your own home, or if you, say, live in an apartment complex that's got a really nice back area. Maybe talk to your landlord about, hey, can we work on maybe not simplifying this as much, or can we leave a couple piles here and there for, some of the spiders and whatnot to take up residence because they're really good at keeping all the roaches and the crickets at nice healthy levels, etc. Excuse me, my ear is itching. A really good example, especially in our area, is the California fan palm. And if you guys are in the lab and you get a chance to either go out to Whitewater or primarily Coachella Valley Preserve, you're going to get a chance to see these guys, especially out of Coachella Valley Preserve. Okay, the picture on the left there is what a natural California fan palm looks like. And these trees are native to our area. They are the only native palm tree in California. So they do belong here. But you'll notice all those dead fronds lying along the trunk of the tree. Okay, the fronds are designed to lay down along the tree and kind of look like a cousin it. Okay, they're really big and hairy and they hang down there. You may think that looks ugly, but that is the way that nature designed it. That right there is an extremely complex habitat. Those dead fronds provide houses for orioles, for bats, for insects, for lizards, for rodents, for snakes. All sorts of species take up residence in there. And it provides, again, a really complex habitat. But what do we do in our yards? Take a look at the picture at the right. We go and we skin our palm trees because we personally think it looks better not to have all that dead stuff hanging off it. But that is a very simplified habitat. Animals cannot make use of something that simple. Also, that dead frond, we call it a skirt, that skirt of dead fronds has a purpose. It is to protect that tree in case of a fire. Okay, these guys are fire protected. If they're in an oasis and a fire comes through, the idea is that the fire is going to burn the dead skirt of fronds, and by the time it has moved through the area, the core of that tree will have been kept safe because it burned around the outside of it, but it didn't kill the actual tree. Versus a tree like the one on the right, if a fire comes along, it's going to kill that tree because there's nothing protecting it and keeping it nice and strong. It also provides wind protection, from knocking into the trunk and um, what's the word I'm looking for? exposing some of those inside layers where it's moving nutrients up and down in the tree. So again, try not to simplify it. Fight back. If you have a landlord who's skinning your palms, talk to him about this. Ask him if they can stop skinning the palms. Ask if there's a reason why you have to skin the palms. If you own your own house, ask your HOA or just stop doing it. See if you can fight back. And as if you let those fronds start sticking around, you're very quickly going to see some really cool species move into your area. All right, the third way that you can alter habitat is conversion. And this is kind of similar to simplification, but slightly different. Conversion is where you take a natural habitat and you convert it into something more pleasing to us. So in the Coachella Valley and most of Southern California, there are lots of examples of habitat conversion. A lot of them, especially in our area, are golf courses. Okay, grass does not belong in the desert. It sucks immense amounts of water. It takes tons of water to water a golf course. In fact, one watering of a golf course in the summer uses as much water as one household uses in an entire year. That's just one watering. They have to water those courses 2 to 3 times every single day. So something to keep in mind. You take a sand dune, you convert it to a casino. You take a rainforest, you chop it, burn it down, and put a simplified crop field in it. You have converted it. Most native species cannot adapt to such a drastic change. They basically have two choices. They can either move to something else, move into another native area, or they die. It also encourages a lot of exotic species to come in. I mean, drive through Country Club Road through our valley, and you're going to see all kinds of species that don't belong here. Red-eared slider turtles, all kinds of Canadian geese, ducks, all these different species and plants also that do not belong here. Okay, we're not supposed to have sitting lakes of water here in our valley. That's just not how we're made to be. European starlings, it's a type of bird. They're invasive. Tamarisk, olive trees, oleanders, all these are invasive and they outcompete our native species. So the difference, how can you tell simplification from conversion? Simplification, sometimes you're leaving a lot of that natural habitat. You're just making it really simple, whereas conversion, you're pretty much wiping the slate clean and turning it into something totally different. So on the test, you're going to be asked to identify examples of each of these. So make sure you're familiar with them. Here's oleander, by the way. Probably most of you are familiar with it and have seen it. This is a good example of simplification as well as conversion. They're used all over the valley because they're very heat tolerant and you can prune them into pretty much whatever shape you want. But it turns out that they are a poisonous plant, not only to other animals but also to humans. And they also outcompete native species, but they also kill native species. So bighorn sheep who don't understand what oleander is, if they get on the other side of the fence and they get into somebody's backyard, they will die from oleander. And it's a very distinctive mark when they die and that their neck is kinked all the way around onto their back because basically they suffocate. So when I used to work with the bighorn sheep, if we came on a dead sheep and their neck was twisted around backwards, we knew immediately that that was a case of oleander poisoning. How can you help? Well, instead of planting plants like oleander, go to your native plant shops. There's a nursery at Living Desert that sells native plants. Up here in Morongo Valley, there's Cactus Mart. I think Morton's might sell some of the native plants too. Do some research, figure out what native plants should be growing in your area, and plant some of them like mallow. Desert mallow is a great plant, and you're going to attract a lot of native wildlife. You're going to benefit your area very much so. Other examples of simplification and primarily conversion is agriculture. You basically compound the problems not only from simplification and conversion, but then you have other issues with erosion, overwatering, pesticides. So it's a whole slew of issues. And you might think, well, I'm not a farmer and I don't eat a lot of vegetables or whatever, but if you're eating meat every day, those vegetables are being grown to feed our livestock, and livestock also contribute to a lot of this issue. 70% of all grain is grown for livestock. So keep that in mind, and that's simplifying a lot of habitat to feed all the cows to make your McDonald's hamburgers. So you can really make an impact by reducing the amount of meat that you eat. Taking meat out of one meal every day really, really helps reduce that impact. All right, moving on. I is for invasive species. And we've already kind of discussed invasive species, so you already know what they are, but they do have a very large impact on the environment. So it says, as we've already learned, invasive species have no natural predators, competitors, or parasites, and they often thrive in their new location because they're free of those limiting factors. They are very costly to remove. They take over and they cause a lot of damage. So this is another threat to biodiversity. You get those invasives in and they take out a lot of the diversity that's in the area that you're working on. A good example is kudzu vine. This was a vine that was brought in from Asia because it had this really pretty leaf and flower, as you can see there in the top picture. People really liked it and it grew really, really well in the South. So we brought it in and we started planting it. Well, again, free of those limiting factors, and it went bonkers. It went crazy. And there are pictures like the one in the bottom where the kudzu literally grew and enveloped, basically ate the houses. And they said it was a case of kudzu eating the South. That's what they said they did. And they're still battling it down there. So you have to be real careful with what you introduce into an area. In our area, tamarisk trees are a problem. Okay, there's basically two species of tamarisk. There's the type that you see growing along I-10 that's a windbreak, and those ones are an exotic species, meaning that they don't come from the desert, but they're not invasive because they don't grow really rapidly and they don't spread and they don't take over like the other ones do. But there's more of a shrub type of tamarisk that does grow very quickly, spreads very quickly, and outcompetes the natives. And those ones grow a lot in our canyons, taking out a lot of the wildflowers. And what tamarisk does is, one, it's super water greedy. So it sucks tons of water. It gets its roots way down there, sucks the water, and it drops the water table. So that all the native plants that had these more shallow roots, they no longer can reach the water. And unless they can grow roots really quickly, they die because they don't have any of that water. Also, tamarisks exude this toxic salt out into the soil from their roots, and so they basically form this ring around themselves where no other plants can grow anywhere near them because of that toxic salt. So again, they're killing off native species that way. Okay, the first P, it doesn't matter, there's not a certain order, but we're going to talk pollution first. So this P is for pollution. You see some pictures there. And obviously pollution causes biodiversity loss by harming organisms in many different ways. Air pollution, degradation of forest ecosystems, water pollution, agriculture runoff, all of these things. Pretty straightforward. You pollute an area, you cause an upset, you kill a lot of species. So that's a major impact on biodiversity. You can read more about this on your own time. The second P is for population growth. And by population, we're talking human population, okay? We are going to spend a whole chapter talking about human population and how we are growing at an exponential rate. More and more humans means more and more resources are being used, meaning that we are consuming more and more things on the planet and taking over. And so for each person that's on this planet, they need things, and that causes habitat loss because you got to grow more crops. That causes more invasive species. That causes more pollution, and it causes more overharvesting. So population has a really important impact on biodiversity. And finally, hippo, the O in hippo. O is for overharvesting or overuse. And some good examples are bycatch. They're starting to slowly change the way that we are doing fishing, but a lot of fishermen still do these big giant nets where they throw these big nets out in the water and then they haul up. They might be fishing for one type of fish, but in that catch they're getting all different kinds of species that they're hauling up out of the water. And what they do is it's called bycatch. They toss them back, but a lot of times by the time they pull them out and sort through the fish that they want, that animal is already dead, or it just can't survive. It was brought up too quickly, and its air bladder bursts or other issues come about. So, dolphins are a major bycatch issue in tuna nets because they go in trying to get the tuna that's caught in the net, and then they also get caught up and killed. So that's a major issue. The picture on the right-hand side there is a picture of a guy standing on a pile of bison skulls. Okay, so there used to be so many bison in North America out in the prairies that as people rode trains across over to the west, they would get bored and they would literally just stick their guns out the window and start shooting bison just for fun because there were so many of them and they would just do target practice. They didn't go back and, eat them or take the fur or anything like that. They just got bored. And people, it was another one of those cases where, there's so many bison, there's no way that we could ever harm them. Well, there are very few native bison left in this area, and they actually have breeding programs where they are introducing bison back into areas where they natively once were. So it is always a case where if we don't regulate that, we can overharvest and we can cause some major issues. And there's a link there, Tragedy of the Commons, which deals with, I think that one is about the oceans and overfishing, so you can read about that. But the idea being that, if everybody goes out there and fishes for as much fish as they want and nobody really takes care of it, we're pretty much going to make all those fish go extinct and then we're not going to have a resource to pull from. So it needs to have stewardship, you need to have sustainability, we need to have sound science practices, those three S's. Overharvesting causes biodiversity loss. Vulnerable species are large, few in number, and long-lived. Examples include Siberian tiger, Atlantic gray whale, sharks, gorillas. You can read more about this. And there are rules that help us slow us down. The first one that came along was the Lacey Act in 1900. We're going to be talking about the Endangered Species Act next week, so you're going to learn all about that. By the way, our state animal for California is the grizzly bear. So how many grizzly bears do we have left in California? A whopping zero. The only grizzly bear that exists in California naturally anymore is the one on our flag. That is it. We caused them, we overharvested them, hunted and killed them, and they became extinct in our state since the 1920s. So kind of ironic that our state animal no longer exists here. Something to keep in mind. So there's a new threat that's come on the scene, and that's climate change. When E.O. Wilson coined the phrase HIPPO, climate change wasn't really a threat. It is now, so that's something that you need to keep in mind. And we're going to deal a lot with climate change later, but you need to be aware of it. And you can read the story on the Costa Rican golden toad there on pages 44 to 45, and that talks about how climate change is impacting biodiversity, specifically those toad species. Okay, so we're going to pick it up here next week. We're going to talk about the Endangered Species Act, the HCP, and CITES. So stay tuned for that when we finish up biodiversity. And then we are going to start diving into water. So that'll be very exciting. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see you guys next week.